Today is all about spring and summer gardening. And so, as we head into the summer season, I just want you to have the best season yet. So, whether you're brand new to gardening or if you've been doing it for years, today's tips are really going to help you get your garden off to the best start possible. In fact, I recently sent out a gardening survey and got over 400 incredible responses. And so this episode is crafted based on the exact feedback that I received from gardeners in my audience. And if you'd like to go even deeper than what we cover in today's episode, be sure to check out the full YouTube live replay. I answered a ton of great questions after the main teaching portion, and there's a lot of extra value packed in. I'll link to that in the description so you can watch the full session whenever you're ready. And if you're new here, welcome. I'm Audrey Crawford, a lifelong gardener from the Central Valley of California, and this is the Audrey's Little Farm Show, where I take the guesswork out of gardening and help you grow a successful garden one simple step at a time. All right, let's jump in. So I recently sent out a gardening survey, and I got over 400 responses from all of you. You may have even been one of them that took the survey earlier on this year, but basically I want to know your biggest gardening struggles and your most requested topics. And so based on the survey, I took 5 of the most requested topics straight from what you asked for. So I'm going to cover that first, and then we're going to go into some of the most common questions that I received. And then at the end, we're going to go into the chat and answer your questions. So one of the most important and most requested topics from the survey was soil health. And I honestly couldn't be happier because soil is everything in the garden. It's where plant health starts, and it's something that we as gardeners can keep improving season after season. But here's the mindset shift that I want you to understand. So instead of thinking about soil as just dirt or a place to anchor your plants, I want you to start seeing it as a living ecosystem, because that is exactly what it is. Healthy soil is absolutely teeming with life. In just a single handful of garden soil, there are billions of microorganisms, things like bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes, and all of them are playing vital roles in supporting your plants. It's like a hidden underground world, and the more we learn to work with it, the better our plants will grow. And now a lot of gardeners stop at just trying to be organic, but this is where I really like to bring in the idea of regenerative farming, but to the home garden. And so it takes this a step further. It's not just about avoiding chemicals, as organic gardening suggests, but it's about actively building soil life, supporting natural processes, and creating a garden that gets more productive and resilient over time. And so now you're likely wondering, well, how do we actually do that? And so the first principle is to protect the soil food web. And that means minimizing disturbance. However, I will say that if you're just getting started for the first time, or if you have an area that you want to turn into a garden that's really compacted, it's a good thing to actually till that soil up to start your garden off, because if not, it's going to be really difficult to get your garden going. So for example, out in my garden, at this point, I've been growing in it for 5+ years, but there was once an area that was a horse pasture. It was super compacted, and it would have took me way longer to get that ground really ready to plant and to be able to allow plants to thrive if we wouldn't have tilled it up. So in that first season, we tilled the pasture, and then since then we haven't had to till. But I'm just letting you know that I know a lot of gardeners say, don't till, but there is a time and a place where sometimes tilling is necessary. And so then after that, once you get that garden bed going, avoid disturbing as much as possible. And instead, you can add your compost right on top, then add your mulch on top of that. And then each year, as the soil microbes and the biology beneath the soil get to work, your soil is just going to improve and get better and better. And then next, we want to make sure that the soil is never left bare. So bare soil dries out, it erodes, and it overheats, which are all harmful to the soil organisms that we're trying to support. So between crop plantings or in unused spaces, you can plant cover crops, or at least have the soil covered with mulch, such as straw or shredded leaves, to keep the soil covered and protected. But if your climate allows, even in the off season, the best thing you can do is keep living roots in the ground at all times. That keeps the microbial community alive and thriving. Another huge shift is thinking about how we feed our gardens. So instead of feeding the plants directly with synthetic fertilizers, our goal is to feed the soil life, because those microbes are what actually feed the plants in a sustainable way. And compost is incredible for this. And the more carbon-rich material we add, like straw or dried leaves, the more we support fungi, which are essential for nutrient cycling and building long-term soil structure. And one thing I love talking about is plant diversity. So most people think of crop rotation for disease prevention, but from a regenerative perspective, diversity is what helps build a full spectrum soil ecosystem. Different plants release different compounds through their roots, and those compounds attract different beneficial microbes. And so the more variety you grow, the richer your soil life becomes. And basically what this means is the more diverse variety of microbes that there are, the healthier the plants are going to be. And so instead of big blocks of one crop, for example, how you see in big commercial ag, a whole field of corn, in a home garden, we want lots of diversity. We don't want just one garden bed full of the same crop. So try mixing things up. And you can do this by interplanting herbs and flowers with your vegetables, and you should plant multiple crop families in one area. And now, one of the most powerful ideas I've learned from studying regenerative soil health is that the most common garden problems, whether it's pests or diseases, are really just signs of poor plant nutrition. And poor plant nutrition usually means there's something out of balance in the soil. So if we focus on building healthy, biologically active soil, we will naturally start seeing fewer problems. Our plants will have deeper color, stronger stems, better resilience, and even better flavor and nutrition. And I just want to say that this isn't about perfection. Building healthy soil is a journey, and you're not going to see change overnight. But if you stick with it, you will start to notice the difference over time. Your soil will become easier to work with, it'll hold moisture better, your plants will be healthier, and you'll see signs of life such as worms increasing each season. So if you take just one thing from this section, let it be this, and that is that your soil is not just where your plants grow, it is your garden. The more you protect and nurture it, the more it will give back. So now on to the next big challenge that many of you mentioned in this recent survey was limited space, especially if you're growing in containers or small yards. And so here are some ways that you can get more out of less space. And the first is to grow up, not out. So you can do this by using trellises for vining crops like cucumbers, peas, beans, melons, many varieties of winter squash and pumpkins, which truly a pumpkin is a winter squash, and even tomatoes. So for example, out in my garden, we just recently, this last year, built a cattle panel arch, and it's been my new favorite way to grow. I grow as many things as I possibly can along the arch. And so I grow tomatoes on one side, and then I do all of our vining crops on the other side. And then on the inside of the trellis, I do things that are low growing, like different herbs and sweet alyssum and marigolds and sometimes different root crops depending on the season. So having that cattle panel arch has been a really great way to make use of those vining crops. You can even have just a single trellis if you don't have room for an arch. And just being able to grow things vertically can really help use your space more effectively. The next thing is to use vertical planters. These don't work well for all crops, but there's lots of different things that do well in smaller containers, or those vertical type planters that are, like a hanging basket, for example. You can do herbs, different lettuces, smaller leafy greens, and strawberries. They also make lots of different bush varieties of berries. And so if you look for bushel varieties of berries, for example, there's different blackberries and raspberries that are much more compact and they grow well in smaller containers. And so there's a few different options for that. And then as far as containers go, you want to make sure that your container is large enough. So for something like a tomato plant, you want something that's at least 15 gallons or bigger. So the bigger, the better. If you have a container too small for something large like a tomato, you're really going to struggle to let that plant thrive. For things that are a little bit smaller, like your squash plants and cucumbers, lettuces, peas, things like that, a container around 10 gallons in size is probably sufficient. But just remember that containers typically dry out faster. So for summer gardening, it's usually a lot trickier to grow in containers. So the bigger, the better. And then the next thing, if you're limited on space, is that you can choose compact or bush varieties. So for example, for tomatoes specifically, there are bush tomatoes, which are bred to grow smaller. There are things like patio cucumbers, dwarf beans, and just lots of crops that are just bred to grow a little bit smaller in size. And lastly, interplanting can also help you maximize your space. So you can plant quick growing crops like radishes or lettuce between slower growing crops like tomatoes, and that lets you use the same space for two different crops at once. And now on to the next requested topic, which is one of the most confusing parts of gardening, and that is trying to figure out when to actually plant. And most of you said in this survey that the reason it's so difficult is because different sources give different answers, and it's hard to know what's right for you in your area. So here's a simple way to think about it. So first off, you need to start with figuring out your first and last frost dates, but don't just start there or plant off that information. You also need to look at the current weather and the future forecast, and you need to plant when the weather is actually favorable for that crop to grow, not just when the calendar tells you to. So, for example, warm weather crops like our tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers, they do not tolerate frost, and they grow best when daytime temperatures are 70 degrees and above, and also when nighttime temperatures are 50 degrees and above. And so it's very common to have a week or two of 70-degree temperatures early on in spring, but then for it to drop back down in the 50s. And that's just not great for these crops to thrive or get a good head start. And so you don't want to just plant your warm weather crops at the first sight of spring, even if it matches your average last frost date. You want to make sure that future forecast has plenty of warm, consistent days in a row, and then plant those warm weather crops. On the other hand, when it comes to cool weather crops like broccoli, lettuce, and cabbage, they grow best in temperatures around 40 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And many of them can even tolerate light frosts. And so if the upcoming forecast does not have enough cool days left in the season, it's likely that if you plant that crop, it's going to just bolt and head to seed, because as soon as the days are consistently warm for a few days or a week in a row, that just triggers that crop, or it is a trigger to that crop that it's the end of their season and they need to reproduce, head to seed, and or flower and head to seed so they can produce for that next generation. And so you just want to make sure that whether you're planting for a late winter or early spring harvest, that you just look at that extended forecast and plant when it's actually ideal for the crop that you're growing. And so one of my favorite tools for planning out my planting calendar and my succession plantings for year-round harvest is a tool called Seed Time. Many of you have probably heard of it. In fact, I did a demonstration of how to use Seed Time in my last podcast all about growing a year-round garden. And so if you haven't watched that yet, I'll be sure to link to that after this live session ends. But then you can go back to that episode and actually watch the demonstration of how I use Seed Time. It's such an incredible tool. And so that is something that I would definitely recommend everybody check out. The next popular topic that was requested during our recent survey was companion planting. And it's such a great way to improve your garden's health naturally. And while it's a really fun and useful concept, there are a lot of myths floating around. So you've probably seen those colorful charts that tell you which plants are friends and which ones are enemies. And while those can be helpful in some ways, they are not always accurate. And so here's the truth. Most garden plants don't magically help or harm each other in dramatic ways. You're not going to ruin your harvest just because you planted wrong neighbors together. What matters more is how different plants influence the overall garden environment, like the soil life, insect diversity, and pest pressure. So when you think about companion planting, know that it's less about secret plant friendships and more about creating a diverse, balanced ecosystem in your garden. When you plant different types of crops together, you attract a wider range of beneficial insects like pollinators, ladybugs, and lacewings, which all help control pests naturally. Certain herbs and flowers like basil, marigolds, and nasturtiums are known for deterring pests. And then from a soil health perspective, having different root types from a diverse variety of plant families in the ground in close proximity, all at the same time during the same growing season, will increase the microbial diversity, which is amazing for long-term soil health. So instead of getting too hung up on plant pairings, think more about mixing up plant families, combining deep-rooted and shallow-rooted plants, adding flowers and herbs to your vegetable beds, and planting things in a way that keeps the bugs and your soil biology happy and balanced. So companion planting isn't magic, but when used thoughtfully, it can really make your garden more productive and pest resistant. But while we're on the topic, I do want to address a few bad companions that are commonly addressed. And the first claim is to not plant beans near alliums, which would be your onions, garlic, leeks, etc., because they inhibit each other's growth. And this idea is commonly repeated. I see it all the time. However, there is no strong scientific evidence that proves that this is actually true. So some believe that the alliums may inhibit nitrogen-fixing bacteria that beans rely on, but this hasn't been clearly demonstrated in any field trials. So with that said, I believe that they can be grown together successfully, being that you give each crop its own space and the proper care. So maybe don't plant them right next to each other, but that wouldn't be recommended anyways. As long as you're giving the crops the space that they need to thrive, they should do just fine near one another. The second claim is to not plant fennel near other vegetables because it stunts their growth. This one is largely true and more widely supported by observation and different studies that have been done. So fennel releases chemicals that may inhibit germination or growth of certain nearby crops, in which case gardeners have consistently found that the fennel tends to grow best on its own. The next proven bad companion is black walnut trees near vegetables. But I'd say for most of us, this is not going to ever be an issue because most people don't have black walnut trees growing in their vegetable garden, but it is a common claim and it is accurate. So the black walnut roots produce a natural chemical that inhibits or kills many garden plants. And then the last common claim is to avoid planting potatoes near tomatoes or cucumbers because they are all susceptible to blight and other fungal issues. So it's not that each crop would necessarily harm one another, but it could increase the risk of spreading more quickly amongst all of the crops. However, most gardening claims are made without common sense, making gardening much more complicated than it should be. And I don't say this in any rude way to anyone who has ever stated this maybe in the online space. But when it comes to something like blight, simply having your tomatoes in one garden bed and cucumbers in another garden bed is not really going to make much of a difference at all. Because, for example, blight spreads via airborne spores and water splashes, and under the right conditions, it can travel dozens of feet or more. And then late blight spores can even travel 10 plus miles under certain wind conditions. And so in a home garden, having plants in one bed and then other crops in a bed across the yard is really not going to decrease the chance of those two crops being infected if one crop is infected, just because we don't have enough space to keep them really separated. So all in all, just know that companion planting, when used to grow a diverse selection of plants in one area, can be very beneficial, but it's not so much about those perfect pairings or harmful pairings. It's more just about adding that diversity. And now, last but not least, let's talk about pests. So bugs like squash bugs, aphids, and cucumber beetles can quickly infest your garden in the summer, but here's a few tips on how to keep them under control. And so the first is to check on your plants daily, especially the undersides of leaves. The earlier you catch a pest problem, the easier it is to deal with. And then when it comes to bugs like squash bugs or beetles, I know this isn't necessarily a fun thing, but hand picking them off can be really effective. You can just drop them into a pail of soapy water. And if you do this daily or at least every couple days, it'll really help minimize that issue. And then for soft-bodied insects like aphids, you can spray off the undersides of the leaves with a water hose. You can even add in a little dish soap. But just remember that the pest insects like aphids are also the food for the beneficial insects like ladybugs. And so we don't want to kill them off as soon as we spot them, or those beneficial insects don't have anything to eat. And then if we spray insecticides to kill off the bad bugs, we're also killing off any beneficial insects, which is even more harmful. And so the next tip would be to use floating row covers early on in the season to block the bugs from ever laying eggs to begin with. And this can be really effective, especially if you do it right at planting time. The only thing to keep in mind is that if it's a crop that needs pollination, then you're going to need to remove that insect netting just as that crop starts to flower. But then also keep in mind that pests are attracted to unhealthy plants. And so the more we work on building healthy soil, that just means that in time our crops are going to be healthier and all of these common pests and disease issues will decrease. And I can say from personal experience that I have not sprayed bugs since 2021. And each year my pest issues are less and less. I've also been continuously working on building healthy soil out in the garden. And I can just see from being out in the garden year after year that each year it gets better and better. And so this last year, for example, the only pest I did have a little bit of an issue with was cucumber beetles, but they were never a big enough issue to really affect my harvest. So I handpicked some of them off when I could, and I would sometimes spray off the leaves of the plants, but it was really never so bad that it hurt the plants themselves. I still had great harvests. And then finally, to help with the pest issues, you can plant flowers and herbs nearby to attract beneficial insects like ladybugs and lacewings, which will eat the pests for you. And this really relates back to everything we talked about with companion planting. If we interplant our crops and avoid keeping all of the same thing in just one area, the pest problems will be significantly less. And sometimes all we really need to do is learn to identify bugs at all stages, because sometimes the larva stage is unfamiliar and we might think it's a bad bug and pick it off and squish it, but it's really something that's beneficial. And so learning to identify all the stages of these bugs is really important. And if you want a really great book for this, actually, I have this sitting here just so I can show you, but it's the Vegetable Garden Pest Handbook. It's one of my favorite books that I've gotten for the garden. It helps you identify all of the good bugs, all of the bad bugs, the damage that they cause to the plant, so you can identify what bug might be causing what issue. And so I'll be sure to link to that in the description. And it's nice because you can just take it out to the garden. You can see the bug in real time and in the book and identify. And so that is it for the teaching portion. Those were the 5 most requested topics straight from the survey responses. And that was, again, real quick: soil health, maximizing space, planting dates, companion planting, and pest control. And now I'm going to jump into your most asked questions from the survey. And after that, we'll move into the live chat and answer your real-time questions. So the first common question was how to know when to plant each crop. And even though every crop might vary slightly, there's really just two groups of crops. There's cool weather crops and there's warm weather crops. So if you can just first figure out, which season it falls into, then you can kind of better figure out when to plant it. Essentially, your cool weather crops, which are things like your lettuce, spinach, broccoli, cabbage, carrots, things like that, they're going to grow in daytime temperatures between 40 and 70. They can handle light frosts. You're going to grow them when there's enough cool days for that crop to mature. And then your warm weather crops, your tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash, things like that, they don't handle any frost. They grow in daytime temperatures above 70 and nighttime temperatures above 50. They'll grow basically sometimes all the way up until that first frost hits. So for example, here in our climate in zone 9, our tomatoes usually will continue producing all the way through November. And then once that first frost hits, it will naturally just kill those plants off. So basically, you just need to figure out which season the crop falls into. And then you're going to figure out your first and last frost dates. And most all planting dates are just based off of that. And so the one thing to keep in mind, like we mentioned just a little bit earlier, is you just want to make sure that you're not going right off the date that the planting calendar tells you. You want to make sure that the actual current weather and the future forecast is in line with what that crop needs. So whether that be enough warm days ahead or enough cool days. The second common question was, what is the best way to build healthy soil? And that, in short, is just to add compost each season. And you don't need to add a lot. You can just add a 1 to 2 inch layer on top of your garden beds prior to planting, and then make sure you add lots of mulch. The mulch itself is going to break down over time, feeding your soil. It's also going to help retain the moisture, and it's going to keep the soil cooler, which is really just ideal for, retaining that moisture, keeping the roots cooler, especially in summer. And then it's good for that soil life, because if the soil gets too hot, if it's bare and exposed to the hot sun, that can kill off some of the beneficial life in the soil. And then you can also use cover crops in the off season. We taught more in depth on this earlier on, but if you've had bad success year after year, I would recommend getting your soil tested. So if you're having great success out in your garden, there's really no need to get your soil tested. So for example, out in my garden, my crops have been growing really well for the last so many years. And so I just add a thin layer of compost on top of the soil before each growing season. And then I add the mulch, and basically that's it. But if for some reason things started to decline, then I would go out and get a soil test. The next common question was, how do I get more production from my container garden? And the first thing is to use larger containers if possible. So at least 10 plus gallons for most things. You want to remember, or you want to use a rich soil mix, and you want to fertilize every 1 to 2 weeks. And keep in mind that this is only for container plants grown in potting soil. So I don't really recommend fertilizing often, and sometimes not even at all, for your in-ground garden if you're growing in native soil, because too much fertilizer can actually cause more harm than good. So it's a very common thing to hear, just simple fertilizing tips like fertilize every 3 weeks, or fertilize at planting time, midway through the season, at the end of the season. There's just all these random things thrown out there. But when you really think about it, you're not fertilizing to just feed plants. You should be fertilizing to replace a missing nutrient. And if you haven't done a soil test to figure that out, it's probably not necessary. And so, but when you're growing in containers with potting soil, that potting soil doesn't have the nutrients and the minerals and all the living life that our in-ground soil does. And so fertilizing tends to be pretty necessary. And because of the drainage and how quickly nutrients just drains out of the potting soil, fertilizing is more necessary. The other thing you can do to have more success with your container garden is to choose varieties that are actually bred for containers. So with some crops, this really doesn't matter, but for certain crops like a tomato that can get really big, they do have varieties that are smaller, and they are bred to be, much more compact and smaller, which is much better suited for a container. And so those are just a few things. Remember that containers are going to dry out faster. And so you're going to probably have to water more often. So just keeping that soil consistently moist, adding a thick layer of mulch on top to help retain that moisture, things like that will really help. The next common question was, how do I deal with squash bugs or potato beetles? And because of the size of these pests, I have not really found that there's any beneficial insects that help keep these in check. And so really just hand picking off the bugs, checking for the eggs daily, picking those off when you see them, or using row covers early on is the only effective way. But you can also plant plant varieties that are a little bit more resistant to these. So for example, crookneck squash, zucchini, and patty pan squash are really susceptible to squash bugs. But varieties like a butternut winter squash are less susceptible. It doesn't mean that you won't have the issue, but sometimes it just means switching up the varieties that you're growing, and that can help make a difference too. And then the next question is, what can I plant in shady areas? So when it comes to our warm weather crops like tomatoes and cucumbers, most of them really need at least 6 to 8 hours of light throughout the day. If they get too much shade, they're going to have much lower harvest, less production. However, with the cool weather crops, they can tolerate less light. So your things like your lettuce and your spinach, leafy greens, lots of different herbs, they can handle a lot less light. And so that's one tip. If you have only a shady area, you might be limited on what you can grow, but you just have to grow things that can handle that shade. But you can also grow quicker maturing crops like radishes or bush beans. And because they mature so quickly, you'll have more success with less light. And then to kind of help those crops maybe get a little bit more sunshine is you can grow vertically if that might help. So growing things up sometimes exposes them to a bit more sunlight. And so using trellises or any kind of vertical growing arch, things like that. Next question is, what should I plant for a summer garden? And so one thing that I think is actually kind of fun is that every year as I go into my summer garden, I'm so excited for all the things, the peppers, the tomatoes, the squash. But then by the end of summer, I'm so excited for all those cool weather crops, the spinach, the lettuce, the broccoli. And so I feel like it's just one of the benefits of eating seasonally in the garden is you really just get to enjoy what's available at that time. Of course, we're used to the grocery store life where you can just get anything you want year round, but it never is going to taste as good as coming right out of the garden. But when you kind of learn to eat seasonally, you really appreciate the things that are coming on in that season. And so I am totally looking forward to all the things that are going to be coming out of our summer garden. My most favorite being tomatoes. Peppers are probably a close second, then cucumbers, all the different varieties of squash, green beans, okra. You can grow melons, corn. I will say one thing with corn that a lot of gardeners don't realize is that you really need at least 15 plants minimum, if not more. And you need to plant it in a block. So you need at least 3 rows because it gets pollinated by the wind. And so you have to have enough corn plants for the wind to pollinate the corn in order to really have success. And so if you just have a couple corn plants or just a small row, you may not get corn at all. So that is one tip with corn. The more the better, and have a minimum of at least 3 rows. In the summer, for a hot climate, you're not going to likely have success with planting things like lettuce and spinach. It's probably just going to bolt and head to seed. However, sometimes you can get away with growing these cooler season crops even in the summer if you can give them a little bit of shade. This might even be a time where you have it in a container, but where you can move it around. You can let it get some morning sun, but then make sure it's shaded in the afternoon. And if you harvest frequently, you can actually still get some harvest out of those cooler weather crops in the summer, which can be really nice. So I know for us here in our family, we love making salads all throughout the summer. So I try to keep growing my lettuce all throughout the summer as long as I can. The secret is just sowing seeds often, harvesting when the lettuce is young, only a few inches tall. And so just those frequent harvests, frequent reseedings, and then you can usually tend to get a pretty consistent harvest all summer long. If I could pick just one summer crop, it would definitely be tomatoes. And then next question is, how do I water efficiently in the heat? And so this is tough just because, gardening in the heat can be a struggle, but it is not impossible. In fact, this last year we had a really hot summer. I think every day of July was for sure 100 plus degrees, if not 110 plus on most days. And I had a thriving summer garden. So the key is to water deeply and to mulch heavily. So I have my entire garden set up on drip irrigation, and I really recommend that for all gardens. I feel like you can't actually water effectively just by hand unless you have hours and hours a day to be out spending in the garden, because you want it to just drip slow. You can have either individual emitters, that you have at each plant, or you can have drip line, whatever you use, but just having something that drips slowly where it really waters deeply and gets to that root zone. And usually even by midsummer, I'm only having to water every other day, sometimes every couple days, just because if you water slow and deeply, the soil will still stay moist, especially if you have mulch on top. And so if you're only watering shallow, you're going to have to water daily, sometimes even multiple times per day, but that's just not great for the plant. So watering deeply, using mulch, use drip irrigation if possible. If you are a member of my membership, Audrey's Little Farm Academy, you have access to my course, Effortless Irrigation. You can also check that out in my Audrey's Little Farm shop. I'll be sure to link to all of that below in the description. Another thing is to actually just check the moisture with your fingers. A lot of times I know we just by habit go out and do different things in the garden, whatever that might be, right? And one of the things is watering. So we might just water daily because we think we need to water daily. But it is a really good idea, especially if your garden bed is covered with mulch and you can't actually see the soil physically, is to move that mulch to the side, feel the soil. And if it still feels moist, you can skip watering that day. So that, in the long run is going to save you money on water. And it just might be that you don't have to be out there daily watering if that soil is actually still moist. So you should figure out what that schedule ends up being for you. The next question is, what is the secret to strong seedling growth? And this, when it relates to growing your own seedlings or starting by seed to transplant out into the garden, the real secret is to first plant your seeds at the appropriate time. What I see is a lot of gardeners start their seeds way too soon, especially when it comes to things maybe like tomatoes, and then they have them in little pots for way too long because the weather's still too cold. And those seedlings end up becoming unhealthy because they're just in little pots for far too long. And so the first thing would just be plant 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date so that your seedlings don't have to be in little tiny pots longer than necessary. The other thing is you really want to make sure they have plenty of light. So you want to make sure the light is right above the plants, or if you're starting out in a greenhouse, which is what I do, I usually will start my tomatoes and peppers in mid-February. And then there's enough sunlight during the day. I don't have to use a grow light and the seedlings are perfectly healthy, which is really nice because then I don't have to worry about the light. I don't have to worry about heat mats. I just start everything out in the greenhouse and it works out really nice, which I know is not always possible depending on what zone you're in. The next thing is to make sure you're also not using containers that are too small. So there's all these hacks on the internet, like planting your seeds in eggshells or in egg cartons, or, those little tiny jiffy pots that are supposed to decompose in the soil. All of those are just so small that you're going to have to repot into something bigger so that the roots can actually continue to grow. You don't want those little seedlings getting root bound. And so something that's too small, it's not even really worth your time to start your seeds in it because you're going to have to either repot it or the seedling's just going to kind of be weak and unhealthy. So I actually start all of my seeds in much bigger pots, at least ones that are like 3 inches by 3 inches, if not the 4-inch wide by 4-inch deep. But then once those roots do start reaching the bottom of that container, uppotting them or repotting them into something larger if it's not ready to transplant outside is necessary. And then the last tip would just be to make sure before you take them out into the garden, just harden them off. So this is just the process of gradually introducing them to the outside conditions, because whether you're growing indoors or in a greenhouse, they're pretty protected from all the conditions of the outdoors, the full sun. I do kind of find that the seedlings that I start out in the greenhouse are just a lot hardier and they transition really well into the garden because they're used to being outside with that natural sunlight. But you do want to just gradually introduce them to those outdoor conditions, to where you're not just going straight from either indoors or greenhouse straight to the garden. And then the next question is, should I direct sow or should I transplant? And this really just depends on the crops that you're growing. So when it comes to our summer garden, so these warm weather crops, tomatoes and peppers should always be transplanted. But then when it comes to certain things like your beans or your carrots, which carrots are a cool weather crop, peas, which would be another cool weather crop, those should always be sown by seed. So there's not as many warm weather crops that have to be planted by seed, but there are many that I actually prefer to plant by seed. And those would include my cucumbers, my squash, my okra. All those crops can be transplanted, but they have very sensitive roots. And so they do much better when they're actually sown by seed. At least here in our climate, we have a really long growing season. And so as long as the soil is warm enough for those crops to germinate, I plant them by seed. They germinate really fast. And then there's no transplant shock. You can just protect your young seedlings from things like birds and snails. Sometimes people do have issues with, critters getting those little seedlings. But as long as you protect your seedlings, I tend to have much better success planting most of my crops directly by seed. And in fact, I actually just created a brand new masterclass called Direct Sowing Seeds for Success. And it goes over all the crops that you should sow by seed. It includes both cool weather crops and your summer crops, and just the process that goes into successfully germinating them, directly right out in the garden. No tools or seeding equipment necessary. And then just tips on protecting them from critters and post-planting tips, things like that. And now the next question is, what should I do if I feel overwhelmed by gardening? And I think this is such a common thing, especially as we see all these people online. And I will tell you that I feel overwhelmed all the time by gardening, just because there's so many things going on in life, right? I have a almost 3-year-old baby boy, a husband, family to take care of, work, all the tasks that go into growing a garden. So even though maybe sometimes the highlight reels that you might see on Instagram look like everything is perfect and dandy, it's not truly how it is, right? I do think that there's actually so much joy that comes from gardening. And sometimes it's actually just the best thing to do is just sit back and actually say or think about why you're growing a garden. And so sometimes I just actually don't really care about the result. It's just about the process of being out there. So right now, I know like our weather it's warming up, but it's not too hot. It's so enjoyable just being out in the garden. And the other day, I actually enjoyed pulling weeds. I had so many other tasks to do, but I just went out into the garden, worked on a little area. I have so many more tasks to still get done, but I just worked on one little area. And because I accomplished one small area, then I felt really good about that. So sometimes it's just about starting small. Don't look at the whole garden. Maybe it's a big picture and looking at every weed to pull. Just maybe say, okay, just one garden bed today, or 5 minutes per day, whatever that might be, right? You also don't have to grow everything. So you can just start small. You can have 3 to 5 crops that you really love. If I had to only grow a few things, I would grow a few tomato plants and a few peppers, and that would be it. And that's perfectly fine. In fact, even when we have loads of summer squash coming on, it's not something that I really want to eat every day. And so if I didn't have them at all, it wouldn't be the end of the world, and it would just be one less thing to care for. So I would say just start small, follow a plan or a checklist if that helps you. And remember that gardening is really just about the joy of gardening. It's a very great way to just get out in nature. If you have little kids or grandkids, it's a great way to get them outside, letting them go pick things with you. One thing that actually just came to mind is sometimes for me, the growing the crops is not the hard part, because I have everything set up on drip irrigation and a timer. And so I don't actually have to physically go out and water. But sometimes once the harvest start coming on, there's so much stuff to go out and pick. It could be a very timely task. And so there are certain things that I actually despise harvesting. Some of them would be like your peas and your green beans. They're just very time consuming. Whereas picking a tomato is pretty quick and easy. Same with like a zucchini or a cucumber. But beans are so small and they're just very time consuming. And so there's certain years where I either just let the beans, get too big, and then I'll just go feed them to the chickens, or some years that I haven't even grown those crops because I don't feel like harvesting. So those are a few tips if you're ever feeling overwhelmed. And the next common question that I got was, why are my plants not producing fruit? And this is such a hard question to answer because it could be so many things. It could be poor pollination. It could be too much nitrogen, too much sun, too little sun. So what I would do is maybe first just work on adding in lots of different plants that are going to attract all those pollinators we need for pollinating our plants to produce fruit. Make sure you're getting 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. And beyond that, there's really not too much you can do. I would say really the best thing you could probably do is just bring lots of diversity into your garden. Sometimes if you just have only maybe one squash plant, one tomato plant, but you got nothing else growing, you're probably not going to get that many pollinators in your garden. And that could be an issue. You can also hand pollinate your crops, but I prefer to let the pollinators do it. So I have lots of herbs and lots of flowers. And that always just seems to solve all the issues. And then next common question is, do I need to fertilize? And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think that actually as gardeners, too much fertilizer can actually cause more harm than good. In fact, I'm trying to think when the last time I even fertilized with an actual fertilizer, because at the beginning of the season, what I do is I add a 1 to 2 inch layer of compost, and then I add my mulch, and that is literally all I do. And I've had amazing harvests, especially this last year in 2024. I had such a great crop of tomatoes, but everything else produced crazy good as well. And so too much fertilizer, what can happen is you can get too much of certain things like phosphate around the root zone, and then it ties up the nutrients, and your plants actually can't absorb the nutrients that they need from the soil. And so if you're just fertilizing to fertilize, I would say, and if you've had poor harvest or poor growth, that could actually be the issue. The other thing with certain fertilizers is if you add too much nitrogen, for example, that's going to cause lots of leafy growth, but it's not going to support strong root systems. And so adding too much nitrogen fertilizer earlier on is going to make your plants grow big, and they might look beautiful, but they're not going to have healthy root systems, and it's not supporting them fruiting and producing fruit. And so in most cases, I would actually say to not fertilize unless you do a soil test and you know that your soil is deficient in X, Y, or Z, and you're replacing that nutrient that's needed, then fertilizing might be necessary. Or and the other exception would be if you're growing strictly in containers with potting soil. And then next common question is, how do I plan crop spacing? So I actually tend to agree with most seed packets and plant tags. I have watched countless videos talking about the idea of ignoring all spacing, and that's only intended for commercial farmers. And I will say, in specific ways, yes. But certain things do thrive with more space. For example, tomatoes. I usually plant my indeterminate varieties, which are the ones that continue growing throughout the season, at least 3 to 4 feet between each plant. And midway through the season, the leaves are touching, the plants are huge. But I know a lot of gardeners plant them closer and they still have success. However, I have wildly successful harvests and the plants get huge because I've given them enough space. They will kind of grow to the confinement that you give them. And there's certain things that can be planted closer together that aren't going to really harm each other. Like peppers can be a little bit closer together. If you're growing things vertically, like cucumbers, they will grow better closer together if they're growing up and over a trellis versus if you have them sprawling on the ground and they're all getting tangled up with, in between one another. Some squash plants can get pretty big, like a bushy zucchini plant. So if you have, them only 8 inches apart, they're just going to grow right into each other. That's going to cause more pest and disease issues. And so actually spacing them out gives more airflow. It usually means you're going to have less pest issues, less disease issues. Harvesting is going to be easier. But the one thing that I think a lot of gardeners just don't think about is that just because you might plant, say, 2 squash plants 18 inches apart, you can still usually grow other things in between. You might be able to grow a basil plant in between because the basil plant is going to kind of grow upward, and maybe your squash is a sprawling type. You can also grow some green onions around the edges. You can shove some marigolds in there. You might have some parsley in the corner, or maybe some creeping thyme that goes over the edge of your garden bed. So you can interplant with lots of things and have, a pepper plant right next to some thyme, or a marigold right next to your pepper plant, things like that. But I wouldn't recommend shoving your 2 pepper plants just 6 inches apart, if that makes sense. So I actually tend to stick with the crop spacing for that specific crop, but then I interplant with lots of things to maximize that space. And then next question is, what's the easiest way to start a raised bed? And so this one is a great question because a lot of videos I watch, a lot of articles I read will recommend that you fill your raised bed with potting soil. The first thing is that this can get really expensive. And then the next issue with that is that the potting mix is technically a soilless mix, meaning there's no real dirt in that soil. So you don't have the real minerals that are found in your native soil. You don't have all the soil life, the microbes, the fungi, the protozoa, all that stuff. And so you are not going to have as much success. It's also going to dry out faster. And over time, because it's a soilless mix and it's made up purely of organic materials like peat moss or coconut coir, the soil level is going to continuously drop because those materials break down and decompose. So I recommend starting your raised bed filled with at least 60 to 80% native soil. So you can buy topsoil in bulk if you actually have access to, good native soil on your own property. You can scoop up the dirt there, or you can buy bagged topsoil. But the best thing would be if you could just get it in bulk. And then you can mix in, 15 to 20% compost at the first time of filling those raised beds and kind of mix it in the best you can. That compost is kind of going to just like make it a little bit more light and fluffy. And then as each season goes on, then you'll just top that raised bed with a thin, 1 to 2 inch layer of compost at the beginning of each season. And then that's good. A lot of times gardeners actually get way too much compost in their raised beds. And then over time, the soil level actually becomes a little bit toxic for some plants. So I just say, start with native soil, topsoil, same thing. It's your true native dirt. And over time, each year, especially if you add organic materials on top, like your shredded leaves or straw, that eventually breaks down into your soil, and that mixture will get better and better each year. And then the next thing, or the next common question, is how do I prevent sunscald or heat stress? So the first thing for really anyone that has hot summers, or anywhere, even if your weather is on the cooler side, mulch is super important. So a thick layer of mulch that's going to help retain moisture. If you live somewhere really hot, you can add some shade cloth in those, really warm parts of summer. Even though we have really hot summers, I don't set up shade cloth, although it would probably be beneficial for some of my crops. They tend to still produce really good throughout the summer, but I think they would be even a little bit better if I were to set up some shade cloth during the hottest part of summer. And then the one thing with tomatoes especially is do not over prune them. So pruning stresses out the plants. It also removes lots of foliage, which then exposes your fruit to the sun. And so the more foliage that you can keep on your plants, the healthier the plants are going to be. And you're also going to get more fruit if you don't prune them. And so those would be a couple of the tips. And then just to water consistently, especially earlier on in the day, and then harvest your fruit early in the day, which is just going to be better for the plants. The next question is, how do I get continued harvest? So there are certain crops like a tomato plant that once they start producing, you can just continue picking off that plant for the entire season, which I guess I should backtrack just a little bit. And that also depends on the variety of tomato you're growing. So there's two types of tomatoes. There's indeterminate tomatoes and determinate. So indeterminate would be like an early girl tomato or a better boy. And what this means is the plant continues growing all season long and producing all season long. A determinate tomato like a Roma, it grows to a determined height and size and typically produces all of its fruit at once for one big harvest, and then the plant slowly declines. And so if you're growing an indeterminate tomato, for example, an early girl, you'll be able to get tomatoes from the start of the season all the way to the end, which is really great. But then there are certain things like bush beans that are similar to a determinate tomato where they produce a lot earlier on in the season where you can pick more at once, but then they kind of slowly start declining. Whereas a pole variety of a green bean produces all season long. So you want to first just figure out what variety you're growing, because some crops don't have to be replanted multiple times. You just continue picking off those same crops. However, I will say that I like to plant a few times, even with tomatoes. So I like to plant a few, or the majority of my tomatoes, at the same time early on in the season. And then I might plant again midsummer, maybe just only 2 plants, and then a couple more plants maybe at the end of the season. And it just gives you some younger, fresh plants in case something happens with that first crop. It's more helpful, I feel like, with things like squash and cucumbers because they're quicker to mature. And then if you have any pest problems, you can actually just then rip that plant out and you have some newer, younger plants to harvest from. And so it's not really a big deal if the plant is, overtaken by aphids, if you have another younger plant getting ready to come on, because then you can get rid of the first and you have that second one going. Where succession planting really comes in handy is for something like lettuce, where you can, plant a small area, maybe of your garden bed. And as you're harvesting from that area, you maybe plant another area of a garden bed. And so you have different stages of plants where you can always be harvesting. As one area starts to decline, you have that newer area to keep harvesting from, and then you're going to get another area going. And you just kind of have to continue spacing out those harvests to keep a fresh produce and fresh harvest coming on. Again, earlier I mentioned Seed Time, which is my favorite garden planning software. They make this really easy, just because you can visually see on their planting calendar how to do that. And you just literally click a button that says add succession, and it automatically spaces it out for you. It shows you when your harvest window will be. It truly just is very incredible and so easy. And then the last question from our questions from the survey is, what is the best mulch to use? And when it comes to the vegetable garden, the best mulch to use, in my opinion, is straw, shredded leaves, or grass clippings. I will say when it comes to grass clippings, just make sure that it's not full of grass seeds or weed seeds, because you don't want all those to start sprouting in your garden. There's also certain invasive types of grass that I don't want the risk of them invading my garden. So make sure whatever grass you might be using grass clippings from is not an invasive variety like crabgrass or something like that that's going to really take over. The one thing just to avoid is that you don't really want to use wood chips or bark in your vegetable beds. And the reason for this is because the wood chips, as they break down, take nitrogen, or it uses up the nitrogen in your soil to decompose those wood chips. And so because vegetable roots are so shallow, as the wood chips decompose, it's taking that nitrogen from your plants. For something like a fruit tree, the roots are so deep, so wood chips are fine, or in a perennial garden bed. But when it comes to your vegetable garden bed, it is best to avoid wood chips actually in your bed. You can use them in walkways, no problem. But I like to use straw, shredded leaves, or grass clippings. That wraps up the most common questions I chose to feature in today's episode, but we covered so many more during the full live session. So if you want to hear the rest, just head to the replay that will be linked in the description below. But most of all, I hope today's episode gave you some helpful takeaways you can put to use in your garden this season. Thanks so much for spending this time with me today. If you love this episode, it would mean so much if you left a review or shared it with a friend. I'll see you in the next episode, and until then, happy gardening.